hone in on the description of these, you're going to find that even some people have kind of this convoluted admixture of all these into one, but still worth knowing, because the people that you're trying to witness to, you're trying to share the gospel with, and try to explain to someone today what is sin. In the idea that sin is both by nature and by choice, and it's something I do that offends the holy nature of God, but God has established objective and very real standards, statements of moral fact. You shall not this, you shall not that. And that sin offends His very law. And as such, we become guilty. We become culpable, as it were, objectively so. Not the subjective feeling of guilt, though that can go with it, but we are objectively guilty, just like we drove 85 miles an hour down the interstate when the speed limit is 65, and we get nailed by the radar gun, and it says, you've broken the law. In what way? In a very objective way, because there was this external standard, the speed limit. You went this speed that exceeded it, therefore you're objectively guilty. So what view of morality could be more tempting, even convenient, than this idea of subjective relativism? I mean, really, what if I'm my own moral universe and I decide, which is what it is. It's not necessarily what you prefer, that's part of it, but it's what you decide. You become the be-all and end-all of determining what is right or wrong. That's on, and I realize this is not a teaching of Scripture or something to advocate amongst Christians, but I'm telling you, it can seep in. The more you live in a culture that promotes this kind of, how dare you have any moral outrage about immoral behavior in your culture. And you can see how subjective relativism, which absolutely doesn't work, it never has, it never will, but how popular it is, because in the eyes of many, it promotes this kind of tolerance that accepts everyone on an equal plane. And once you accept everyone and everything and every belief and every assignment of moral value on an equal plane, you have no plane anymore. You have nothing to... It's a recipe for social disaster, which is what we're seeing and what we've seen in other cultures. So subjective relativism. It says that action X is right for Anne, make up a name, if she approves of it, yet wrong for Greg if he disapproves of it. And you get the idea. Thus, action X can be both right and wrong. So this is on subjective relativism. You can't point the finger, nor can they at you. What's right is relative to you, to your moral universe, and thus with the other person. So a person's approval of an action makes it right. And at the end of the day in ethics, when we're asking the question, not what is right and what is wrong, but what makes something right or wrong. Is it the law? The law makes it right or wrong. Well, who created the law? A group of individuals, and that's evolved over time. We started with these kinds of laws, added more kinds of laws and laws that govern us. Thousands of laws are created every day. But is that what makes something right or wrong? And this is what we're really talking about in this discussion. What makes it right or wrong? And the subjective relativists would say, I do. I make it right or wrong. Can you imagine a society? Seriously, if you universalize this nonsensical point of view, then you have everybody in a given society who is not accountable to any standards whatsoever except their own. And so whatever one person might think that it's perfectly appropriate to take advantage of the rest if by doing so they can acquire as much wealth as possible or acquire as much power as possible. After all, their ideas are just so wonderful. Therefore, they have to conquer all the weak in order to amass all the power. And you get where all this can go. You have a recipe for the ruination of society. So many people claim they're subjective relatives until they realize the implications of this particular doctrine. And I'd say first, implication. Implication. This is, if you're keeping track, it's like page 24 in your notes. Subjective relativism implies that in the rendering of any moral opinion, each person is incapable of being in error. That is, each of us is morally infallible. Now, when we say that the Bible is infallible, we're saying, on the one hand, it has no errors, but on the other hand, it's incapable of being errant because God, the author, superintended the process of its transmission through human writers such that the product is as pure and inerrant as the God who revealed it. Right? And so when you think of someone who says that they're morally infallible, it means simply because I can't be questioned. I can't be questioned. You know, it's my own moral universe that I live in, and no one else lives in it with me. So that's the first objection. What does that really boil down to then? It boils down to there can therefore be no moral discourse. We can't have a public discourse as to what's right or what's wrong, what's appropriate and what's to be prohibited, what's harmful and so on. There can be no moral disagreements. And so subjective relativism implies that such disagreements simply cannot happen. So those are two things. One is moral infallibility, and the other is a complete lack of disagreements. And you're saying, wow, that doesn't sound like a society that I want to live in. And in fact, you're quite aware of it when you're in that situation, because you're shaking your head thinking, is this person lost touch with their mind? They can't see that this is wrong. And they're quite outraged that you would find some problem with this destructive moral behavior. So in practice, subjective relativism is a difficult view to hold consistently. You know, at times, of course, you can insist that an action is right for you, but wrong for somebody else. But you may also find yourself saying something like, well, what Hitler did was wrong. I mean, look at the pages of history. And what you mean by that is that Hitler did something that was objectively wrong, not just wrong relative to you. And so if you hold to subjective relativism, then you'd say, well, Hitler in his own moral universe was right because he deemed his actions to be justified by the good, the ultimate good. And if you hold the subjective relativism, you have to hold it consistently. And whether it's Stalin or Lenin or Mussolini or and we're citing the worst, but what about just the petty thief that breaks into your home or whatever? You cannot object on subjective relativism. Sounds ridiculous, I know. But let's take a look at then something quite similar, and that's cultural relativism. All it does is extend out from the subjective relativism of one and makes it this kind of aggregate whole of a particular culture. So almost what you're saying about the lone individual being the moral universe, you then just extend that out to a particular culture. So to many people, the idea that morality is relative to culture is quite obvious, just seems, because cultures are so different, and then the values and the assignment of value to certain behaviors and outcomes. You know, honor killing, yes, okay, you know, but in another culture, no, abhorrent, reprehensible. So sometimes this is linked to the study of sociology and, you know, how different societies behave and all such. So let's just take a little consideration of an example kind of highlight, this notion of comparing one culture to another. So we know that the moral judgments of people in other cultures are often shockingly different. We mentioned the honor killing, but for example, killing infants at birth is permissible, in some cultures. Eskimo practice infanticide, which is killing of infants. It does not reveal a different attitude towards children, but was a measure to ensure the survival of the family. And this is on certain sociological perspectives, right? Because adoption was primary for surplus babies and killing was the last resort, but life forced choices upon them that we do not have to make. So the sociologists would say that they were driven to this abhorrent practice of infanticide simply because it would have a better chance of preserving the family and less having all of this surplus population that they couldn't take care of, something of that regard. Or burning widows alive with their deceased husbands, the funerary pyre, in Hindu belief at one time in history, widow burning, the variety of these funerary ceremonial practices. These people sacrifice themselves, of course, during the funerary rites of a high-ranking person even. So even if it isn't a wife, it could be a ruler, a master, a husband, something like that. Back in the times of the Egyptian pharaohs, there would be thousands and thousands buried alive with the pharaoh, because it was believed that in the afterlife they would go with him into the afterlife. They would bury whole ships, with the pharaoh, and all of the provisions and everything that was necessary to convey him into the next life. And all those servants, of course, would be necessary as well. But the belief underlying this body of this suicide, like the funerary pyres, suicidal practices, is that the deceased will enjoy the same goods and services in the beyond as he had on earth. She's got to, go with him into the afterlife. So what seems to lie at the heart of the practice of following in death is the settling of a debt of obligation, of love, binding the various parties together. And this is a sociological perspective. In order to give warrant or justification for these within a certain cultural context. In other words, what we have to say is that although the act is abhorrent to us in one culture, we would never do that, how barbaric, but in their culture it's understood as being an act of devotion, an act of service and things like that. That's the notion of cultural relativism that says that act is right because that culture approves of it, backing up to subjective relativism. That act is right because I say that it's right. And just as with subjective relativism, with cultural relativism, one culture cannot judge the acts of another culture. So there's a small step from acknowledging this moral diversity among cultures to the conclusion that cultures determine moral rightness and that objective morality is a myth. And that's on sociological ways of describing cultural relativism, for example. So your book mentions Walter Stace, the concept of morals. And he goes into detail a little bit by giving an example. Here he says, it was easy enough to believe in a single absolute morality in older times when there was no anthropology, when all humanity was divided clearly into two groups, Christian peoples and the heathen. Christian peoples knew and possessed the one true morality, and the rest were savages whose moral ideas could be ignored. And so he's trying to make the case that now we're just more enlightened. Now we've applied anthropology, sociology, we better understand cultures, we better understand their intent, and so how dare we impose from our Christian ivory tower this notion that there is some moral objectivity. that there is some universal moral standard by which every act, regardless of the culture or the individual, would be judged. That is, relative to that universal standard. And that is what makes the act right or wrong, not the cultural preference or the individual preference. So Stace spells out in rough form the most common argument for cultural relativism and an inference from differences in the moral beliefs of cultures to the conclusions that cultures make morality. That's in essence, again, what makes that act right or wrong. So you'd lay out the argument for relativism basically like this. It's a three-step argument, right? So here's our first foray into a moral argument. So let's look at the argument for cultural relativism. So the first step in the argument, or premise one, so we have two steps and then a conclusion. So premise one, a major premise, a minor premise, and then a conclusion. Premise one, people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture. You know, do we agree with that or disagree with that? And the way the arguments work is you start with something that you'd more readily agree with, and then you continue the inferences, you know, to eventually something that maybe you wouldn't agree with, but you have to start with every premise when you consider an argument in terms of whether you agree with that or not. So people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture. Do you accept that or do you not accept that? Two, if people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, then right and wrong are relative to culture. And there are no objective moral principles. And you'd say, oh, okay, that sounds reasonable, but you have to just hang on for a little bit. Number three, therefore, right and wrong are relative to culture, and there are no objective moral principles. So a good argument gives us good reason to accept its conclusion, and an argument is good if its logic is sound. That is, the conclusion follows logically to the premises, and the premises are true. So with regard to the argument that we just gave you, the three-step argument for cultural relativism, the logic is solid, and so the argument is valid, but it does not mean because the logic is solid and that the argument is valid, that the conclusion need follow from the premises. So the question then becomes whether the premises are true. And without objection, premise one is certainly true, that people's judgments about right and wrong vary from culture to culture. Okay, we get that. But what about premise two? Does the diversity of views about right and wrong among cultures show that right and wrong are determined by culture? Now that's taken a big step now. That there are no universal moral truths, there are good reasons to think this premise is false. So if there are good reasons for rejecting premise two, the supporting premise for premise one, it follows that the conclusion is false. For example, just because people in different cultures have different views about morality, their disagreement does not prove that no view can be objectively correct. No more than people's disagreements about the size of a house show no one's opinion about it can be objectively true. It just quite simply does not follow. For example, suppose culture A endorses, as we said, certain Eskimo populations, endorses infanticide, but culture B does not. Such a disagreement does not demonstrate that both cultures are equally correct or that there is no objectively correct answer. You go back to premise one and you say people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture. Most certainly they do, but that does not mean that all are equally valid, as premise two is beginning to tell us. It only says that observationally, you can look at one culture and the practices, remember, scientifically, descriptively, and say, yes, there are different points of view, but that does not suggest that they're all equally valid, and it does not suggest that one is objectively true one is objectively false, or that both are objectively false, for example. So another reason you doubt the second premise here comes from questioning how deep the disagreements among the cultures are. So judgments about the rightness of actions obviously do vary across cultures, as premise 1 states, but people can differ in their moral judgments, not just because they accept different moral principles, but also because they have different non-moral beliefs. They may actually embrace the same moral principles, but their moral judgments conflict because their non-moral beliefs lead them to apply those principles in very different ways. If one person thinks it's loving to do something that another person would consider is unloving, where is the objective standard for what is loving, for example? This is far more than we can really get into here, but it is an interesting subject to probe. When you begin to evaluate and consider certain practices and what induces those practices in certain cultures, and then how certain people in the cultures, or certain cultures as a whole, attempt to justify those practices. And there's an author by the name of Solomon Ash, and he maintains that, and this is the bottom page 27, he maintains that differing moral judgments among societies often arise when the same moral principles are operating, but the particulars of cultural situations vary. For example, some philosophers argue that the core set of moral values, including, for example, truth-telling and prohibitions against murder, must be universal, otherwise cultures would not survive. But these points demonstrate that premise 2 of the argument for cultural relativism is false. Other observers claim that across numerous diverse cultures we can find many common moral elements, such as prohibitions against